At some point in your life, you may have been told that there are only five things that humans need to survive: oxygen, water, food, shelter, sleep. Personally, I would put sleep at the top of that list, ahead of oxygen even. Though we all know that all the items on this list are all true, I would like to share with you another item that would be added to the survival list for humans. That is biodiversity. Biodiversity is a variety of life at all levels, from genetic diversity to the diversity of entire ecosystems. Ecosystem services are the resources nature provides us free of charge, like drinking water, crop pollination, nutrient cycling, and climate regulation. For instance, the diversity of insect and avian pollinators is crucial to agricultural productivity, ensuring plants produce harvestable crops for human use. Biodiversity is important to add to our human survival list because it is diminishing due to human intervention. Human intervention has led to pollution, habitat loss, and overpopulation. These interventions have caused a lack of biodiversity in our ecosystems. Although these factors seem negative in nature, they are inherent of the progress that humans have made. Farmers and environmentalists are working together to develop farm practices that promote biodiversity and sustainability.
We have 7 billion people on this planet right now, but in 25 years' time, there'll be 9 billion. There's the same amount of land, there's the same amount of water to feed those people. The only way we're going to do that is by embracing science and technology and allowing change to happen. We have to be able to use the best of everything. Best of organic practice, the best conventional practice, marry the two together and make them work.
What we need to do is to make sure we use that available area as best as we can for food production, but also producing biodiversity at the same time. And that's why we need to make sure that people understand how to manage these areas best.
Let's consider how biodiversity is important in our agricultural systems and see the problems that arise without biodiversity in agriculture. One farming practice that contributes heavily to the lack of biodiversity is monocropping. Monocropping refers to the practice of growing only one type of agricultural product in a large area of land year after year. In industrial crop production, monocropping is used to facilitate planting and harvesting across large pieces of land, as well as the application of pesticides and fertilizers. These techniques reduce the amount of human labor required for production, which drives down industrial crop prices by eliminating labor costs. However, monocropping ultimately imposes additional costs on society. This practice became prevalent in industrialized countries in the 1940s and 1950s. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average farm grew 5 or more crop types, and usually with a mixture of crops and livestock production. At the beginning of the 21st century, the average farm was growing only one type of crop. Monocrop farms replace formerly diverse habitats and add to the loss of native varieties of crops. Due to monocropping and a lack of biodiversity, there are other effects that contribute to the problem. For instance, soil erosion, invasive species, and the use of pesticides. Why should we care about soil erosion and its effects on topsoil? Soil is the Earth's fragile skin that anchors all life on Earth. It is comprised of countless species that create a dynamic and complex ecosystem and is among the most precious resources to humans. Increased demand for agricultural commodities generates incentives to convert forests and grasslands to farm fields and pastures. The transition to agriculture from natural vegetation often cannot hold on to the soil and can actually increase soil erosion beyond the soil's ability to maintain itself. Human activities, particularly agricultural and deforestation, have increased erosion rates, as they tend to remove the protective vegetation and reduce the stability of the soil. In fact, half of the topsoil on the planet has been lost in the last 150 years. The effects of soil erosion go beyond the loss of fertile land. It has led to increased pollution and sedimentation in streams and rivers, clogging these waterways and causing declines in fish and other species. Biodiversity also maintains ecosystems where all living things work well together. Without biodiversity in an ecosystem, you have the perfect climate for invasive species. Invasive species are a species that is not native to a particular area, but arrives, usually with human help, establishes a population, and spreads on its own. Invasive species have much larger impacts on an ecosystem than any other species. An example of that here in Minnesota is the zebra mussel, which has now invaded many of our pristine lakes. Zebra mussels have spread throughout the Great Lakes region very quickly since the 1980s. Mussels need hard surfaces to live on, and zebra mussels take up that space that native mussels could use, or sometimes just settle on top of the native mussels, killing them in the process. The monoculture that breeds these invasive species leads to a lack of biodiversity by damaging the ecosystem they invade through habitat modification. For example, where an invasive species may change the pH of the soil, making it difficult for the native species to receive the nutrients needed to survive. Invasive species also compete with native species for resources such as water and sunlight, and become predators on native species, bring in pathogens, and hybridize with natives, which leads to a loss of genetic diversity. All of these negative externalities of invasive species lead to an even less diverse ecosystem among monocultured farms. Lastly, it could be argued that pesticides cause the greatest damage to the biodiversity of an ecosystem. Growing only one type of crop in a large area of land causes crop vulnerability to insects, weeds, fungi, and other pests. The vulnerability to pests often requires intensive use of insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. The negative result of intensive pesticide use include loss of biodiversity and elimination of key species. Adverse health effects for both consumers and agricultural workers, water pollution and soil contamination, and pest resistance, resulting in the need for increased application of pesticides.
If your business is not profitable, you cannot be sustainable. This is a yield map, and it shows the middle of the fields producing 12 to 14 tonnes a hectare, which is a very good yield, very profitable yield. But the outsides of the fields, you can see the dark brown and the orange are very much lower yielding. These will cost us money to grow. We plant wildflower strips around the edges of our fields, and then we get lots of beneficial insects, predatory insects, which will eat the aphids that will try and damage our crops. So not only are we taking out a bad area of production, we're enhancing the wildlife, and it means the average for the field goes up because we've taken the lowest yielding out, and therefore reduces our cost of production.
There are many things that can be done to promote biodiversity. Some examples include permaculture, cultivating indigenous crops, protecting indigenous livestock, and participating in crop breeding. Permaculture is the designing of a farm based on the principles to help increase biodiversity. Permaculture refers to designing land to take advantage of natural ecological processes by integrating a variety of crops, animals, and pests into one farming system. Stasia and Christoph Norden have developed a permaculture project that teaches farmers about methods to incorporate composting, water harvesting, and intercropping to help build organic matter in soils while conserving biodiversity. Another way to promote biodiversity is by cultivating indigenous crops. This has been a result of the Green Revolution, where, as before, many countries relied on growing Western crops, such as maize, instead of local crops. To help increase biodiversity, farmers are going back to their roots and growing more indigenous vegetables, fruits, and grains. In South Africa, Richard High discovered that by cultivating more indigenous crops, he was able to improve biodiversity on his farm. His 23-acre farm saw higher yields than ever before when he started integrating indigenous vegetables, fruits, and livestock into his production. Next, protecting indigenous livestock breeds is an important thing to do since the UN Food and Agriculture Organization warns that around 1,710 breeds of livestock, or 21%, are at risk of extinction worldwide. Indigenous livestock are often better suited to local conditions and are better at resisting pests and disease than exotic breeds. Lastly, crop breeding consists of breeding crops that are resistant to pests and diseases and better adapt to drought or flooding can help make sure that many crops don't disappear. The Global Crop Diversity Trust, whose executive director, Carrie Fowler, is an advisor to Nourishing the Planet, focuses on increasing biodiversity through an endowment that funds projects aimed at crop diversity. The trust, working with the FAO, helps fund pre-breeding programs that help farmers identify which traits are useful to improving crop resistance to disease and pests. In conclusion, it is important to consider biodiversity and the effects of a lack of biodiversity as we interact with nature through human interventions and farming practices. It is our responsibility to be stewards of the environment through sustainable practices.
It's not given to you by your parents, but your land is lent to you by your children. And if you just think about that, it implies that we are stewarding our land. We have a duty of care to look after our land and preserve it and improve it for the next generation.